Neil and I are really appreciative of the feedback that I'm excited to get on this new book project. We're aiming to get it back to Cornell soon. They've invited us to send it there for review, and so our goal is to try to get this out in the next few months. So feedback you have on theory, research design, empirics is all incredibly welcome, and so I'm particularly looking forward to the Q&A there. And the motivation for this project, I think, really began for a lot of us that study alliances and extended deterrence. Came from the past few years when there was an observation amongst policymakers, amongst academics, that there was appearing to be a waning interest in how a lot of leaders sort of view the importance of alliances. Obama was well known for sort of criticizing the special relationships because he felt like Great Britain and other allies were not contributing enough. President Trump called NATO an obsolete alliance. Even Bob Gates and others sort of criticized European allies for free riding and not contributing their fair share to alliances and to even military spending and other things like that. But a lot has changed in the past year. It's been a little bit more than a year and a month since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there has been, to some degree, a resurgence in the conversations about the importance of alliances and security commitments. And there are certainly some scholars, including many here, that have argued that allies might be more reckless and willing to press their claims, encouraging this form of reckless driving escalation, and even questioning the security value of alliances, especially when you think about the costs and risks that are incurred by the patron or by other members of the alliance. And there are others that have suggested that the US must continue in their role as leader, to bolster NATO's presence and to be a strongman or to be a leading authority figure in the international system, especially when we think about the Russian invasion and sort of how to counter Russian aggression. From our perspective, though, it's really this divergence in these different perspectives that have prompted the main puzzles that we explore in this book project, both theoretical and empirical. And this is largely because there has been to date more limited and sometimes mixed results and findings that have come out of the literature, especially on what the side effects, the range of side effects or consequences are of nuclear weapons and nuclear alliances on the international system, especially when we think about particular outcomes of interest that we might care about, like moral hazard, the risk of conflict, or even escalation to full-scale war. For example, Michael Beckley's examination of conventional military alliances is probably one of the most robust that we have. And in this project, he argues that conventional defense pacts create restraint and help prevent recklessness. And he only finds evidence of entanglement in about 5 out of 60 alliances. And what he argues in the book, or in the project, is the only way to build a powerful case of entanglement theory is to commit serious methodological errors. Obviously, none of us want to do that. The more recent and significant work on nuclear umbrellas comes in part from a book by Furman and Sexer, where their research suggests there's not a lot of clear evidence that allies or client states of nuclear powers are actually emboldened. So before we get into our theory and before I present some of our initial framework for understanding, I just want to go over a few of our definitions and probably in this, I'm going to use some of these terms interchangeably, in part because we do that in the book and we try to be consistent, but I might use some of these terms interchangeably as I already have. Nuclear umbrellas are one form of an alliance commitment that we often use interchangeably with nuclear security assurance, nuclear defense pact, or other commitments to extend deterrence to protect a client state or an ally. Now, unlike conventional alliances where there's not necessarily a commitment to use nuclear weapons, these commitments are all operating in the shadow of nuclear weapons, meaning that if at any point the patron seems it's necessary, they might decide to forward project nuclear weapons to come to the allies' defense using those weapons. This is really distinct from conventional alliances for obvious reasons. But what's important for our perspective is we also want to be thinking about how these alliances have different arrays of consequences or outcomes that might be helpful for us in our understanding of them. There might be some optimal benefits, especially for an ally that is in operating in a tense or insecure environment and needs that patron to come to its defense. And there might be some perverse side effects that have been written about extensively, including moral hazard, reckless driving, or other potential forms of entanglement and entrapment for the patron state. So it's really this debate on side effects or consequences that has led to the core research questions that we pursue in this project. First, has the American nuclear umbrella motivated client states to actually press their claims more than they otherwise would have without US support? And I can talk in the Q&A about why we chose to focus on American nuclear umbrellas. Some of the sort of, to be brief about it here, some of the core reasons we chose it is we have the best data on it. But to some degree, I think it represents the most significant nuclear umbrella in the international system. There have been others, but from our perspective, this is really the one to focus on. And there's been a lot written on it, and there's a lot more data that we can use to think about it. Second, and more broadly, do commitments to extended deterrence create that moral hazard and recklessness that lead client states to become more emboldened because they know the patron will come to their aid in the event that there is a conflict? And lastly, if this is indeed happening, and there's the debate about this, right? If there is indeed emboldenment and entanglement, what can we do? Are there ways to actually design institutions and defense pacts to adequately mitigate these risks and actually bring down the temperature for patron states that are potentially in these types of environments? So the argument, just before I get into the theory a little bit, in the book we present a new argument that ironically the same mechanisms that actually help extended deterrence work can increase the risk of moral hazard. But it's most likely, in our estimation, to appear in diplomatic and bargaining outcomes, not in outcomes related to conflict. And to manage these risks, allies can actually create and design institutions to limit their commitments and encourage restraint. But importantly, and I think counterintuitively, and this is where the title of our book comes from, mitigating this risk requires that patrons induce uncertainty about the strength of their commitments that makes deterrence actually work. And we call this the patron's dilemma. By making these alliances a little bit less strong, maybe even inducing a little bit of concern about assurance, you can reduce the likelihood an ally will become reckless, but you also make the alliance a little bit shaky, and that sends an important signal to the adversary about what that alliance is. So managing this trade-off and this dilemma and sort of really carefully kneading this thread this thread is really important, and it's something that's often very challenging for allies to do. So as I mentioned at the outset, this research is actually part of a larger book project that delves into both sides of this coin. The first part of it comes from a paper that Neil and I wrote back in 2016 or 17 on extended deterrence and where we find evidence of moral hazard. And as part of that project, we kept getting asked questions about, well, this seems really bad, right? We don't want moral hazard amongst allies, even if you only find it, and previewing the findings a little bit, but even if you only find it in this one area, we still don't want this. So what can we actually do to help mitigate those concerns? And it was that question that sort of sparked for us the second half of the project, which is if you have this concern, you have this sort of cause of extended deterrence, of moral hazard in extended deterrence, is there ways to resolve it in some way? So I'm going to try to go through and present both the evidence of moral hazard and recklessness in its limited form, and then also to talk about some of the ways in which we explore restraint through institutional design. I'm going to present some theory and empirics from both parts of the book. And in doing so, we build on some really, really rich existing scholarship that explores the benefits of alliances, like aggregation of military capabilities, as well as some of the burdens of alliances, like the risk of entrapment by emboldened allies. And from a lot of this literature comes, I think, one of the core hypotheses from the conventional wisdom or from the common wisdom. And here, the word conventional does not refer to conventional alliances, but really the sort of common wisdom in the existing literature. This main hypothesis argues that allies are going to engage in moral hazard and entrap their more powerful nuclear allies in seemingly unnecessary and risky conflicts. And this is going to result in an increase in the likelihood of disputes and potentially even an escalation in ongoing disputes. So for us, we wanted to sort of tackle this conventional wisdom and also test some of the implications of that hypothesis. And in doing so, we put forward a new theory about the role of nuclear weapons in these alliances. We argue that nuclear weapons actually increase with capability that does shift the balance of power with adversaries for obvious reasons. But really what's interesting and for us to note important here is that bargaining theory actually poses a slightly different added argument to this theory. Bargaining theory, canonical bargaining theory, suggests that as a result, if you do see the shift in the balance of power, targets or adversary states are going to act rationally and offer concessions to avoid engaging in costly conflict with a nuclear patron. Right? They're going to see that the dynamic has shifted a little bit. Maybe the probability of victory has also shifted. And instead of engaging in conflict with this ally, they're going to offer concessions to try to avoid that war. So nuclear umbrellas offer these diplomatic and impact diplomatic and bargaining outcomes short of conflict as adversaries are trying to prevent the rise of these potential crises. And that should occur in the distribution of diplomatic influence among client states and settlements that are being offered by adversaries to those client states. So this graphic just helps to illustrate that argument, that even with the additional power of a nuclear patron, there should still exist a bargaining range where we can see that the effect of moral hazard is actually going to result not in conflict, but in diplomatic influence, concessions, negotiated settlements that help avoid an escalation of war. And it's here that leads to the two core hypotheses that we explore in the first half of this book. First, allies that are protected by the nuclear umbrella are more likely to receive an increase in diplomatic influence, and here we measure that as diplomatic missions from other states. And second, allies protected by a nuclear umbrella are more likely to get their preferred outcomes peacefully than counterparts that are not protected by a nuclear umbrella. So to test this, we conducted directed dyad analysis of all states from 1950 to 2000 to differentiate the behavior of the initiator here, or the challenger, the allies, and their targets, the adversaries, to assess this logic of moral hazard and see where we're actually finding some of those outcomes of interest. Our explanatory variable measures whether the dyad received a defensive commitment from a nuclear weapons state. During this time period, there are about 150 defensive pacts or defensive agreements where a little less than half of them include a nuclear weapons state. So there's actually about a 14% likelihood in this data set that a potential challenger is protected by a nuclear umbrella. Here's where our data comes from. I'm happy to sort of talk about our coding of these in the Q&A, but they're really from the canon, so none of it's particularly new or controversial. So just to give you a sense of what the distribution of our data looks like, perhaps surprisingly, because I think even when I first started this project, I was a little bit surprised at the variation in some of these variables. There actually is really interesting and important variation in diplomatic recognition in some of these politically relevant dyads. As recently, for example, as a couple of weeks ago, Iran asked diplomats from Germany to leave and declared them persona non grata after Germany expelled Iranian diplomats in the aftermath of Iran sentencing a German national to death. Right, so there's actually some very interesting and politically motivated variation in diplomatic missions, the number of people in a diplomatic mission. And we argue that this is actually a very important measure of some of those concessions that might be offered or some of the sort of dynamics that are at play when you have an ally. Okay, so what do we find? The next couple slides just give you a really brief summary of the key findings from our research. I have regression tables in the back. I just didn't want to bore anybody with them right now. So here we first explore the conventional wisdom, the common wisdom on moral hazard. And we find little evidence that nuclear umbrellas actually embolden their allies, except in one instance, which is the one-sided use of force. So this suggests that there may not be too much support to support that common wisdom here that allies entrap their patrons in costly conflict. And obviously this has really important implications for how we think about these debates in grand strategy. So we wanted to look elsewhere for maybe some effects of moral hazard. And here we find support for our argument that the effects of moral hazard or this potential recklessness of allies can indeed be seen in diplomatic outcomes here, such as diplomatic recognition generally, and then again by level. And lastly, we examine the effect of nuclear umbrellas on whether the ally or its adversary are likely to concede and offer a settlement. Our findings here again suggest that nuclear umbrellas increase the likelihood that targets or adversaries will be forced to offer peaceful settlements to help them avoid engaging in costly conflict with nuclear patrons. So with these findings, I think we were slightly more confident that while allies of nuclear umbrellas can be emboldened in certain circumstances under certain conditions, there's not a general increase in the likelihood of war. And if anything, and in accord with bargaining theory, adversaries engaging or observing these defensive pacts are actually more likely to avoid conflict, offer concessions, or offer peaceful negotiations and settlements to avoid sort of being entangled in war with a nuclear patron state. So that leads us to, I think, what is some degree of interesting results on the first half of this project about whether or not recklessness exists. And in these small ways, it does. And so in the first half of the book, we use the case study of Taiwan to sort of trace how there's been ebbs and flows in Taiwanese behavior as a result of the commitment and strength of the U.S. defensive agreement. And initially during the first and second Taiwan Straits crisis, and even more recently. But I want to, with time considerations, switch gears a little bit to talk about the second half of our book, which is the other side of this coin. If we do find these instances and very specific scenarios where allies actually are producing some degree of risk for their nuclear patrons, even if it's in these small one-sided instances of force, that might still be too much for patrons. They might still want to find a way to strategically mitigate these risks and actually reduce the likelihood that they would result in anything, even one-sided risk of force. So this is where, in some degree, we ask this question: how can states rationally design institutions to mitigate those concerns and those particular risks, but still benefit from these alliance agreements? So in the first half of this, in this manuscript, we argue that patrons can indeed design these institutions by withholding costly but important reliability enhancing provisions to create uncertainty about the credibility of that commitment, and in doing so, induce restraint amongst allies. Our logic examines the behavioral patterns of client states as a form of revealed preferences, because directly observing assurance is quite difficult. And there are going to be clear incentives by allies to misrepresent how and to what degree they actually feel assured. In fact, having done field work in Japan and in Europe, if you ask any ally of the United States whether or not they feel assured by the US Defensive Pact or by NATO, they say, no, we need more assurance. And that's always going to be the case. They're always going to want to feel more assured. So rather than rely on rhetoric or cheap talk from those actors, we instead want to see what they do. We want to look at their revealed preferences. So in that sense, we explore different outcomes like observing their effects on military spending, the pursuit of indigenous nuclear weapons programs, or even their alliance portfolio, the number of other alliances the ally joins, among other variables that are interesting. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over the preliminary findings here from a couple of different outcomes of interest. And this is the part of the book that I think we're really interested in feedback on, especially when it comes to whether or not this narrative and some of the evidence we're marshaling is compelling. I'm not going to present from it today, but the case that we're exploring here is NATO for this half of the book. So if you have any thoughts about different cases that could be more interesting, or other sort of things that you would like to see as empirical analysis, I'm really keen to hear that. Okay, so first we explore the effect of reliability enhancing provisions on the likelihood of domestic defense spending. And our findings suggest that allies that receive fewer reliability enhancing provisions, meaning they feel less assured, are going to be more likely to, and these are the three different manifestations of that, are going to be less assured by the commitment to extended deterrence, because they're going to, what we observe in that is there's going to be an increase in the amount of spending or the amount of resource building that they do in terms of maintaining their own military, compared to clients that are protected by nuclear umbrellas with greater reliability enhancing measures. So that's the counterfactual. whether or not a state has these different types of provisions or an ally that does not. And what we see here is that there's actually a pretty significant impact on their own domestic military spending when these provisions are excluded. So what happens when we consider the effect of those provisions on the pursuit of nuclear weapons? Again, our findings here suggest that when patrons are withholding reliability enhancing provisions and making the alliance less assured, client states are indeed more likely to pursue nuclear weapons programs, depending on the type of provision in question. So these findings are consistent with our priors and with our expectations from the theory, and I think provide a relatively clear indicator of whether client states feel assured by a patron's commitment to extended nuclear deterrence or not. Right, so you can imagine, especially in the earlier parts of the nuclear proliferation waves of the 1970s and 80s, when there were instances in which maybe clients were not feeling protected by those alliance agreements, think here Taiwan, even South Korea, they might have pursued their own indigenous nuclear weapons programs as a way of sort of testing the waters with their patron state. When the United States caught wind of this, they then offered a whole host of things to both increase the feelings of assurance, but also threaten potential punishments if the client state did not stop those nuclear weapons programs. Okay, so what does this mean for things that we're talking about and thinking about in the immediate context? There's obviously some pretty interesting implications for us in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about what happens if there were to be some sort of an attack or accidental attack on a NATO state, even particular targets of Russian aggression. There's been conversations about potential sabotage in Romania and other partners of the United States. But this is particularly of interest when we think about what happens if it's a NATO member state. We've also seen a lot more talk and discussion about what happens if the United States or other Western states increase the amount of advanced military weapons contributions to Ukraine. Here, there's been a conversation. It initially was tanks, then it was Patriot missiles, now it's F-16s. What this would suggest for that escalation ladder with Russia, if indeed there is this continued contribution of military aid to NATO member states who then contribute it to Ukraine, and then what the risks of that pose to the United States and to NATO. From our perspective, and I think what the research from this book demonstrates, that there's a really careful weighing of risks and benefits here. And there's not a really clear strategy. Every decision and every strategic policy comes with costs to it. So if the United States continues to provide advanced military capabilities to Ukraine, and that's viewed as an escalation by Russia, so far it has not been, then we're likely to see there's going to be some questions about what that looks like on the ground as it unfolds. And I think from the perspective of our research, this also has some really important implications for NATO states that are looking at this agreement, trying to engage how the United States responds to some of those risks and decides whether or not they're going to engage in their own risky behavior because they want to support Ukraine, and what our role and response is going to be if that happens. So I want to wrap up with a few conclusions from our research and some of, I think, the implications of this line of inquiry. And it's been a journey for us to get to this point. We've been working on some version of this project since 2017, and so we're really eager to get this done. But of course, I'm excited to hear your feedback on this. Just to give you a sense of what I think some of the core contributions and conclusions from this research are, the risk of moral hazard does exist under certain conditions in states that are protected by nuclear weapons. That risk is real. But they're not going to be necessarily observed in full-scale war. What we're likely to see is there's going to be one-sided use of force, maybe an escalation in diplomatic tension. But really, even when these allies are emboldened, we're more likely to see adversaries trying to de-escalate, offer concessions, and stop the likelihood of full-scale war with a nuclear-armed patron state. They would prefer to not have that type of outcome. But all is not lost. Even if these are risks that we deem unnecessary and we're less willing to take over time, and certainly there's going to be preferences that change between administrations, there are ways to ensure that allies are actually feeling more restrained and they don't press their luck against those adversaries. So we can do that by designing these institutions in particular ways that help by inducing restraint, decreasing assurance, and helping to avoid entangling the United States in conflict. That comes with a risk. The more you do that, the more the adversary starts to question the strength of the commitment, but maybe there's a way to sort of thread that needle that would help us with that. And lastly, as we're observing now, this has important implications for key alliances that we're talking about and that we care about, not just large multilateral alliances like NATO, but even smaller bilateral alliances like US-Taiwan and US-South Korea. And I think this is where, from our perspective, one of the main contributions of this work can be is to really tap into not some of the sort of canonical debates in political science and security studies, but also to try to address some of the key policy questions that are going on in this administration and future administration. Jim and I were just talking about how it seems like the focus right now for the Biden administration is Ukraine, but there's going to be other things that come up later on. Especially if there's a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, this is going to be another pressing issue. So being able to speak to some of those questions and thoughts would be, I think, very helpful. And also, I think, will just provide us with some interesting points of conversation for that debate. So with that, I will end here, and I very much look forward to your questions and your comments.
Terrific. Before we begin question and answer today, I have a short announcement. And you have a question already? No, oh, I see. Just pause. I love the enthusiasm, though. We've been given our charge to help Professor Mehta generate ideas that can be helpful to her as she goes into the final stretch here. But I want to begin with the announcement. Perhaps you are familiar with the tribulations of Idaho Governor Brad Little, a deep red conservative in a deep red state. I know you're security studies people, but maybe you've paid attention. Well, it turns out that Governor Little's lieutenant governor thought that Governor Little was insufficiently conservative. So when he would take brief business trips out of the state, she would assume power and issue new decrees. First, she imposed a ban on mask requirements, which the governor reversed when he returned to the state. He went on another trip, and she immediately sent the Idaho National Guard to the Mexico border. When the governor got back, he reversed that order. She later ran for higher office and lost. Friends, today I am the lieutenant governor of Idaho. There is a new sheriff in town, and for a day, we are handling question and answer differently than has been done for decades. First, there will be no two fingers. I appreciate the concept. I don't think it works in practice. Second, there will be one question or comment per person, one and only one to be enforced. Now, if we get through all of them, then we'll go for a second round, or we'll go through a third round. If you have 5 questions, you can answer them all, but everyone gets to ask a question before someone gets a second question. And then finally, is there any other thing? Oh yeah, I cannot keep a list. I admire those who can. I'm gonna call on people when you raise your hand, and we're gonna sort of just work around the room. In all my years at MIT, I've never sat there on that side of the room, and it scares me. So we'll come there last. Because I'm assuming there's self-selection, right? Why are people sitting there? Okay, so that's the new rules. All right, we're gonna go bang, 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 maybe to the internet. Internet will welcome your questions. Please proceed.
All right, so thank you. Love the talk, and I have 2 questions.
You don't worry, I'll do it.
I'm testing the credibility of the threats made by Jim Walsh.
Don't interrupt.
All right, so my first, actually, I have a comment and one question.
One.
Yes. So the first comment is that the data that you cover has the bipolar period of the Cold War and the unipolar period. Does it matter in terms of your data? My question is the bargaining range that you show appears to me to be for lower level demands. In other words, there's not on the right-hand side an area of existential threat, which would actually, if that occurred, would as the power dynamics change, might actually reduce the bargaining range. And so that might explain why it is that the issues don't turn to war, because the issues aren't important. I guess those are two comments, if you want to respond.
Yeah, respond to one, and then we can always come back to the second when we're done.
So I'll maybe hold on the data question because I have an answer to it, but I can't remember the exact results. But the second point, super interesting, and thank you for both comments. I think you're definitely right. There's going to be a variation in how the nature of the issue and dispute is going to affect both the likelihood of settlement or the likelihood of one-sided use of force or even the likelihood of conflict. We run an analysis for that. I just didn't present the findings for it, and I don't even think I have in the appendix. But I think we actually found that regardless of the scale of the dispute on the MIDS index, we don't find observable differences in how the adversary is responding. I can double check that, but it's a super interesting point that we should talk about in the book no matter what. But if I remember from the data correctly, regardless of how intense the issue is, even if it's an existential threat, like I'm wondering if I'm going to survive a potential attack from an adversary kind of threat, there's not going to be a huge difference because of the scale of the power of a nuclear patron coming to their defense. But super great point, and I will definitely make sure that we address it in the book.
I'm going to go to the back there in the corner. Yes, anyone? Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a Stanford Nuclear Security Fellow here, and I look at foreign nuclear deployments, especially in NATO, so I'm very interested. I also look at Canada specifically, so I was just wondering if there's potentially an alternate logic here that's kind of unexplored, that nuclear alliances for certain states create abundant reassurance so that they're not, instead of moral hazard, they have less incentive actually to engage in military spending and free ride. And that might give them incentives to concentrate on other things, for example, diplomatic efforts, or put themselves out there on the international stage in a different way. This was the case in Canada. So could it be that there is also a reverse logic going here, that for more assured states, you're less likely to have enhancing measures there, and that could actually result in things like less military spending, rather than the lack of enhancing measures causing increasing insecurity?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, and I need to unpack it a little bit, but my sort of gut reaction is, what would be the incentive to be really assured? Like, you don't get as much good stuff. If you constantly are coming to the ally being like, I'm just not satisfied, I'm going to need more money, I'm going to need more, I want you to contribute more to the defense agreement than I do, which has historically been the case for the United States. The United States always contributes more than any other state. There's almost very little reason to come across and appear assured than to be unassured and get all the goodies that come with that. However, I think for us, from our perspective, we can look at that empirically to see both when the reliability enhancing measures, from our data set, the reliability enhancing provisions are present or absent, and then we're observing what the likelihood is on increased defense spending. But maybe we can play around with the model specifications to ensure that we're not having endogeneity or causal reverse causality. I think, though, I like the logic. I'm just slightly skeptical because I'm having a hard time picturing, aside from Canada, who's like super nice, like what would be the incentive to do that, right? It's always better to come across as unassured because you get all the good stuff that comes with it. But I like the idea, and it's definitely something we're testing out.
Abandonment threats by the China ally,
Yeah.
I'm already stepping.
This side of the room, yes, sir, you were fast even before I started.
Thank you. Just wanted to know about the quantitative charts that you put out, but like starting a new nuclear weapons program because of being not assured.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what are the kind of numbers there? How many programs there? Like, is there good enough number to give power to the regression behind that? And wondering if assurance is really playing the role. Like, if like South Korea or Taiwan abandon their nuclear weapons program. I'm sneaking in.
It's an elaboration on the first question.
So good question. There is strong data on that because we're actually using some of the data from Philip Leake and others, including myself in my first book, that looks at the pursuit of nuclear programs, which account for about 2/3 as many than existing nuclear weapons states. There's been about 33 countries that have pursued nuclear weapons programs, both technologically and politically speaking. And so there's plenty of data with observations over time to be able to capture that. I didn't get a chance at the second point, but maybe I'm not allowed to.
You can go ahead. You're the guest. You do what you want.
Is assurance playing a role, meaning like, is that the reason?
So I was like,
You're kidding. Stop. Go ahead. Are you done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we here and then you, Barry. This side of the room that scares me. Is there a question over here? If not, we'll come back to you. Good.
So I'm interested in kind of the way we measure moral hazard. I've been wrestling with this in my own head, and I haven't come to a good conclusion. So even when we hear people talk about banks and finance and whatnot, it seems like moral hazard can produce calculated but reckless and offensive behavior, right? So greed heads running banks know what they're doing, and they cut all kinds of corners quite deliberately to put the money in their pocket from cutting those corners. There's a second kind of moral hazard that has to do with people just not thinking clearly about risk. They don't bother to assess risk because they feel like they have some cushion. It's just there behind them, right? And then the third, which may be a manifestation of one of the other two, and we usually use the term cheap riding in international politics, is underinsurance. And underinsurance, I suppose, could be calculated, but it's a kind of a negative thing. It's not that you're taking, volitionally taking risk. So it seems like you have some evidence for all three, but the evidence varies in its strength. And I guess I'm wondering is, what do you think about how you parse moral hazard into particular behavior categories? And then what kind of a finding is it if you find a whole lot of evidence of one but not much evidence of the other two? Does that somehow weaken the moral hazard argument? Or is there potentially a selection effect in this data that's producing that outcome in this sample, right? So this is a deep meeting because you've done a lot of thinking about this, and I haven't really achieved closure on mine, so I guess I'm kind of exploiting you here a little bit. But
Thank you so much for this question. So I didn't get a chance to share the chapter that this builds on, but we try to disaggregate those three different types theoretically and talk about what some of the observed consequences would be of each type. I think empirically, the one that we're really largely able to pick up on is the first one, which is a calculated, reckless, offensive behavior. And the reason I say that is because not just in the large N data where we're sort of seeing what the manifestations of that would be, but certainly in the case study. Our case study of Taiwan has archival documents from Chiang Kai-shek where you can see him very calculatedly, very clearly saying, if I push this lever, here's what the US is going to do. I'm never going to be satisfied. It's very clear strategic thinking. It doesn't come across as someone who's like, I just don't know what the risks are going to be, or someone who's underinsured. It feels like the first category. So even though theoretically in the chapter we try to disaggregate those three different types, and we actually have a banking example, like a financial example in the chapter, from my perspective, I think the one that matters the most is this first one. And in part because it seems like that would be the hardest one to find evidence for, because those actors are the ones that are most likely to cover their tracks. And so from our perspective, sort of from a causal inference standpoint, that's the one where it would be the hardest to find a result. And if we see a result, especially in the case, we're given a little bit more confidence that that's the mechanism that's likely at play. But I completely take your point that part of our job in the empirics is to both parse those mechanisms out and to try to find evidence of them. There could be a selection effect in the data, in part because what we're observing is just, outcomes like militarized interstate dispute at these different levels. I would imagine that at some of the lower levels, you could make an inference that maybe this is someone who's underinsured. But since the data doesn't allow us to get into it unless we go and code each of the disputes in great detail, and I'm actually part of a project that's trying to do that, look at the signaling behavior of each dispute over time to see how one actor is operating and what the response to that is, then we could get a little bit further into in the large N data at disaggregating those mechanisms. But I think that's one of the value of the cases is we're able to do a little bit better at that. But I completely take your point. All three are operating. We just need to do a little bit more research to figure out, and more clarity to figure out, to demonstrate that.
Front row.
Thanks, Zach Burdett. Thanks for the talk. So I think your case studies may get into this, but on the quantitative side, I think there may be a slight disconnect between the quantity of interest you're presenting and then the implications and policy conclusions. And that with some maybe generous causal assumptions that you're presenting the average treatment effect basically, and that in the implications and policy conclusions, we're often curious about the edge cases and outliers, right? We're wondering if we were to extend the nuclear umbrella to Ukraine or to Taiwan formally, what are the implications of that? And the average treatment effect of it may be nice to know how things like Spain fit into the story, but so I wonder, is there a way, or maybe you've done the analysis that you could look at what the easiest thing is probably look at what are the leverage or influence points. Are there outliers who are driving a lot of the behavior, and that if you actually subset away some of the like the cases we don't consider that important or risky, that there are certain states that are driving a lot of the risky behaviors that you have identified. And if you looked at those leverage points and figured out, okay, what's the local average treatment effect for these edge cases we're concerned about, and maybe that's the case studies, but I'm curious if you kind of looked into that. If we're actually only worried about a subset of this, and it only takes an outlier or two to start a great power war, right? And that's what we really need to worry about.
Yeah. So it's super interesting point. I don't think we've done that yet. So we'll definitely do that. One of the ways we try to accomplish that, or at least to avoid the concern that you're raising, is by looking at politically relevant dyads. So we're not going to be looking at like U.S. Papua New Guinea and worried like Papua New Guinea is going to start a war and we have to like combat it. I don't know. Maybe someone from Papua New Guinea is going to correct me, but like, so we try to avoid some of those dyads where you think this is unlikely to result in the outcome. But I take your point that if we remove or we at least control for certain cases or use fixed effects, we could try to get at that question. And you're right. I think the case studies try to tap into that a little bit because large N looks at average treatment effect, but the case studies are really meant to look at critical cases that are, I don't know if they're like outliers in the same way you're thinking about them. I think they're like case in points of what we're trying to describe. But maybe that's an outlier from the average treatment effect of like a normal state in NATO versus like a Taiwan or something. So super good point. I'll make sure that we address that in the large N. Thank you.
Right side of the room. Okay, well then we'll go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Oh, I'm sorry, did I jump you?
No, you're.
All right, we're adjusting. What are costly reliability enhancing provisions, and what would withholding them look like?
Yeah, so thank you. I didn't get a chance to go into this too much in the presentation. We do a little bit more of this in the book, but this is where I think we're starting to tackle some big revisions on this part. So the reliability enhancing provisions, I can at least describe a couple of them to you. Conditionality, military institutionalization, and economic cooperation. So it's the degree to which there's conditions imposed on the institutional alliance, the nature of the relationship between the two militaries in question, and whether or not there's economic cooperation built into the design of the alliance. So withholding those would be in the design of the alliance per se. There's not going to be strong military institutionalization. There's not going to be specified economic cooperation, and there's going to be more conditions imposed on the treaty. Did that answer your question?
I'm chewing on it.
Okay.
I wanted something like really concrete that like I could hang my hat on, like
An example.
Yeah, example.
Example. That's basically the word example.
Yeah. Ooh.
For each
Can
category.
I think on that and come back to you? Because I don't remember like a clear example other than what the provisions per se are. But you can imagine like, no, I can't imagine. Let me think about it and I'll come back to you, or we'll chat in the lunch or something.
Okay, I'm going to check with these guys. Yes.
I know you've heard of nuclear weapons. I'm sure you've heard of it.
So if if I understand correctly, what your research shows us is that if a client has a nuclear umbrella, they're more likely to have one-sided conflict initiations, and then they're more likely to get better settlements out of this. So my question is, how come there is not a lot more evidence for this? How come we've managed to reach a point where the conventional wisdom tells us that entanglement shouldn't exist, if what you're finding is that every single rational state, because I'm assuming rationality assumption applies, every single state should be saying, as soon as I get my patron to give me nukes, then, start going after every single state you've ever had a grudge against?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you so much. It's this, I get a similar version of this when I talk about proliferation and whether or not states proliferate to try to get inducements from the United States to stop proliferating. And I think it could be happening. It's a completely plausible argument. I think my response to that is it's a really dangerous game to play, right? Because these are, as you note, average treatment effects. And so if you have an outlier adversary who's like, absolutely not. I'm not going to be blackmailed into conceding to you and giving you what you want simply because I'm worried about war with the United States, bring it on. Then the ally has now made a very costly error. And it's the rationality definition that we're employing is an economic definition, right? Which is increasing benefits, reducing costs. So for an adversary, they might absolutely see that potential crisis and say, this is to my benefit. I have domestic political reasons where I want to show off to the United States, or there's something in it for me if I stand up to, this minor ally that's bullying me because they have the protection of the US. So even in that economic rationality definition, there still could be adversaries that are responding to this and saying, we want to go ahead and escalate.
Of course, but on average,
right,
we should see a lot more of this.
I think we do. I just think we haven't, I think this goes back to one of the other questions that was raised earlier about the nature of the dispute. Some of these don't rise to a militarized interstate dispute in the data. So they might be things that are much smaller scale that occur that we maybe don't really notice, or the United States sort of prevents it from happening at the earlier onset. I think it just depends a little bit on the issue in question, but you're totally right to say, why isn't this happening more? Shouldn't we be seeing it all the time in the literature or in the historical record? I guess my answer is I think we do. They just maybe are coded slightly differently, so they're not coming up in some of these big data sets. But I like your point that we absolutely need to be thinking about how even variation is existing in some of these really initial forms of dispute management before it even comes to the point of being coded as a mid or something like that. It could be, for example, something that comes up in like Todd Sexer's militarized compellent threat data set, where you're seeing it as like a threat and then is resolved rather than even something that comes to being coded as like a dispute in question. But super, super good point and something we should think about.
Okay.
You're pointing at me?
I am. You're the former director. What am I supposed to do?
Well, I'm just asking about pointing information. In the large N treatment, how are nuclear allies of the United States treated? So do Britain and France, does their behaviors end up in the data set or they're excluded from the data? They're excluded, okay.
I apologize. I should have mentioned
No,
that.
I didn't mean that to be kind of
I should have mentioned these are only non-nuclear clients.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that there were, okay, good,
yeah.
thanks. Good.
So my question's related, so first off, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. My question's sort of getting at whether certain sources of variation matter in the research, and I apologize if I missed the detail in the talk. But I was curious as to what extent there's variation in the type of nuclear umbrella commitments that states are receiving, sort of whether that variation matters in the design. So I guess another way of asking the question is, are all nuclear umbrellas the same? Kind of went to Britain and France similarly, but I was curious as to whether, for example, it matters that some nuclear umbrella states sort of engage in nuclear weapon sharing agreements, so whether that matters, versus a state that sort of gets a stated commitment, or we see some nuclear umbrella recipients sort of more tightly military integrated into sort of plans for tactical nuclear weapon use, particularly during the Cold War. So I was curious as to whether that kind of variation, I guess, in the treatment of the nuclear umbrella is sort of modeled, or whether it's sort of more of a binary treatment, like they sort of receive some sort of umbrella commitment and then we sort of study it from there.
Yeah, this is a really cool point and something that I want to think about how to include it, at least in the first half. Because you're right, in the first half of the book, when we're looking at the effects of a non-nuclear client state being included in a nuclear umbrella, it's a binary, whether or not they have one or not, a nuclear patron or not. Those issues come up in the second half because some of those are the types of provisions I'm trying to get at, which is whether or not there's like I'm thinking about Japan and the United States having really tight coordination on military, right? Like if you go to the Seventh Fleet, there's actually like both Japanese and US military operating together. And there's other instances in which there's variation in that. Some it's really tight, some it's very more loose. And so I think in the first half, we treat it as a binary, but problematically so. And maybe there's a way that we can think about opening that up a little bit. We use the ATOP data, which I think codes it as just a yes or no. But that's something that we can think about trying to explore and open up a little bit in the first half. In the second half, it's exactly those types of disaggregated characteristics that we're actually trying to see whether or not impact if then you see increase in domestic military spending, an increase in pursuit of nuclear weapons programs indigenously, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Let's stay in the back of the room and get another question, then I'll check with you guys in case there's one on the internet. Great. In the back, you've already asked. New questions in the back? You've already asked. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Linda. I'm also a Stanton Nuclear Fellow. So perhaps you've kind of addressed this in your talk, so in that case, I apologize, but it seems to be that your argument is very much, so there's a lot of reassurance, so you're gonna feel free to like behave recklessly. But I'm wondering whether there's not like a lot of potential omitted variables that might actually encourage states to engage in what can be considered as quote unquote reckless behavior. And I think NATO, of course I'm biased because I'm very interested in NATO. NATO might be an interesting case here because it does seem to be, if those are the three kinds of reassurance that you look at, that they're kind of all of the NATO allies seem to be coded similarly according to these criteria, but we see like a lot of differences, like variation within NATO as to the extent that different countries might be willing to engage in what can be considered reckless behavior. So I wonder whether we can really say that the US reassurance and the nuclear part of it is really the key thing that drives this, whether there might be like other reasons why states might do this.
Absolutely. I would be the biggest entitled jerk if I were to say that my theory is the only right one. Of course not. And I actually think this is a big weakness of a lot of the research that I and others are doing in nuclear studies, particularly. We still are operating as though they're unitary actors, and not just like NATO as a unitary actor, but even within NATO, there's all sorts of different domestic political pressures being applied to leaders to have different policies that they're done bringing into NATO that the U.S. is responding to. So I think you're right. There's a fair bit of omitted variables bias happening here. I guess what I would say is you're totally right on that. But if we believe, and I think I do, that we're at least contributing some part of an answer to this discussion, and from our perspective, hopefully providing a little bit more evidence on some of the mixed results we're seeing in the existing scholarship that Maria was bringing up and others are bringing up, then we're getting a little closer to understanding the conditions under which this is occurring, even if it's not the only thing at play. And maybe that's helpful. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think so. Like, I don't think we're in the like paradigmatic shifts of like, completely changing the universe, but I do think we're providing evidence on things that have been historically, there's been conflicting findings, there's been completely plausible arguments made on both sides, and if we're providing a little bit of evidence on one side or the other, that seems helpful, but you're absolutely right. And I think in our NATO case, that's one of the things we go into, is trying to delve into specific countries' responses to this policy, players at, the things that are at play, not just domestically in each of those countries, but then how they're operating in the NATO, aggregated at NATO level, and then how the US is reacting to that. It's like sort of like a Milner two-level game in that sense.
Let me pose the question myself. We'll check the back of the room, and then we'll probably go to second round questions. But the question I have is a small one. It's meant in the spirit of trying to be helpful with the project, even though it may not sound like that. Your choice of diplomatic recognition as a metric, I got to say, just emotionally, my reaction to that was, well, that doesn't seem very persuasive. And that's an emotion, not an argument. So this is an invitation to unpack that a little more.
You love diplomacy.
I love diplomacy.
Well, then what's your complaint?
It's not a good metric for measuring escalation problems. I mean, it's a good metric for some things. And then the question is differences in diplomatic engagement a good metric for this? And it seems like it's sort of weak tea compared to the big thing we're talking about, which is nuclear weapons and conflict.
Yeah.
And so, and it seems like, you're able to tease out the difference between a country who's an ally but not under a nuclear umbrella versus a country that's an ally in a nuclear umbrella, but also those are going to be really powerful states with whom we're going to have stronger relationships.
Yeah.
So tell me why, and I'm sure it is, and it's just because you're in a rush, why this is a good metric.
I mean, I don't think I necessarily disagree with you. I think it's a decent metric. I think it helps us with things like, I'm teaching a class of research design, so that's what I'm thinking about, like face validity and concept. But I agree with you that it doesn't get at what we care about. I mean, I think the negotiated settlements variable probably gets a lot better at that. This was meant to be a spectrum of things that are happening, because you're not going to see, I mean, it's not even necessarily going to be the case that when an adversary sees a small-scale skirmish with a non-nuclear client state protected by a nuclear umbrella, that they're going to provide a settlement. There's going to be a variation in the dispute nature, and so we're going to then see the diplomatic recognition or level of diplomatic mission as like the smallest form of an outcome that we're observing, the negotiated settlement being the highest form. I think the reason we came to it, and this is where I would love ideas that you have on how to strengthen this concept and this operationalization. I think the reason we came to it was because so much of what we see outside of the experimental framework is going to be, it's not behavioral, it's going to be like cheap talk related, right? There's going to be things that are being said by policymakers that we're a little bit worried are going to be cheap talk, or they're going to be not something that's systematic. And so from our perspective, to create a large and systematic variable that helps us with this, and we can provide this range in an outcome, that was what we came upon. There's some existing literature that has used that as well. So we thought this was a good proxy, but you're not wrong. Like, I think that's actually where the cases really help us to tease out that mechanism and show it's piece by piece by piece of the mechanism to show those effects in the behavior. But it's really hard to come up with systematic behavioral outcomes that are not going to be endogenous. So I think I don't disagree with you. I think we even say that in the book chapters, like, this is not ideal, but here's where we're coming from with this. And we provide a lengthy defense of it. But I think it's a problem. I mean, I think in most of our data is that we're looking for revealed preferences, and there's very few instances of it on the small scale of things. Like, yeah, you can see conflict behavior relatively clearly. You can see troops being moved, you can see missiles being deployed, you can see tests of missiles. It's really hard to be like, I'm mad at you, I'm going to say something, and then the adversary is like, well, I don't want to be said that to, so I'm going to like just give you what you want. Like, all of that small scale stuff, really hard to capture systematically.
So we're going to move to, okay. The internet speaks.
This one comes from Joel Sokolsky. Does the data show that protected states fear that nuclear patron states might be too eager to come to their defense with nuclear weapons, a kind of annihilation without representation?
Wow, that's another thing I'm going to worry about at night now, to add to my list of everything else. I think it's super interesting. I had never thought of that, just because I would like to think the nuclear patron states are responsible actors and are not interested in annihilating someone else just to like come to the defense of an ally. I think on a more realistic level, that seems like an overshooting of a problem that can be resolved through hopefully diplomacy, hopefully bargaining, hopefully scaring an adversary to come to the negotiation and settle. So I don't think we've seen any evidence of that. I think there were times, I want to say there was some time during maybe the first Taiwan Straits crisis where Chiang Kai-shek was actually pretty successful in appealing to the US. And I think they were very close to providing nuclear weapons to put nuclear weapons on Taiwanese territory as a deterrent to the Chinese. And they saw the benefits of that, but I think they were ultimately stopped from doing that. And anybody who's an expert on the second Taiwan Straits crisis can correct me on this, but I've never seen a nuclear patron state be like, yeah, let's go defend an ally with nukes. Usually we start to see things resolved way before we get to that. But yes, added to the list of nightmares.
Okay, well, we did deploy MACE missiles in Taiwan, and we might have put conventional warheads on them, but they're kind of useless satellites. And if you want a counterexample for all this, consider Suez. Now, I know you exclude Britain because they were a nuclear weapon state, but France was a participant, and they were not yet a nuclear weapon state. And we kind of left them dangling out there. And it was perhaps the most severe example of a threat of abandonment. So that's it.
Thank you.
We're almost, I still want to get the people who haven't had a chance to ask a single question. So yes, and then yes.
I have a question related to your measurement of the democratic recognition and engagement. I'm wondering, are you time delaying these in your model? And I guess I'm just sort of thinking ahead, because you're interested in these lower level interactions. There's a lot of other things that are going on that these states might be initiating some diplomatic shifts or unrecognition, and in response to other actions by, let's say, the United States or by the other states. So I guess I'm just wondering to what extent this measure is just capturing what's going on at a diplomatic level, and to what extent you're able to tie it to policies or actions or other things that are happening within the nuclear umbrella. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Great question. I can't remember on the time delay. I don't think so. Just remembering the regression table in my head a little bit. I don't think we do that. So I think that's something we can do. And this question about can I causally trace the recognition to the outcome? I would love that. I mean, man, I would love to randomly assign diplomatic missions to countries and then see what happens. Turns out no one's gonna let me do that. But you're right. And I think that's a weakness of that measure. I think the other measures that we look at, like concessions and negotiated settlements are a little bit better, because the settlement, the issue of in dispute that is pertaining to the settlement, we can trace back, right? So we can get a little bit of not causality there, but we can see a tighter association, especially time-wise there. But the diplomatic recognition variable, I don't think we can do that, because we'd have to be able to show in the MIDS data set that there was a dispute that led to this variation in recognition, or the level of the mission. And I don't think they do that. So weakness of the variable, but we definitely try to address that in the cases. Yeah, thank you though.
We had a new one, yeah.
My question is this about nuclear weapons at all? Or is this about sort of the relative power that the US has to sort of make its way in the world, especially because a lot of the action that you find is in terms of diplomacy and negotiation? Is this just about these countries having sort of the imprimatur of US backing when they go out in the world and try to get something from an adversary? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I think it's something we've been tackling. I think we've tackled that in the reviews for our chapter, for our article, and also in our book as well. It's how much of the heavy lifting of the causality is being driven by nuclear weapons, rather than just the idea that the US is a conventional ally to these client states. So theoretically, we try to tackle that, and we try to show why that's distinct, especially since some of the literature and the conventional alliance aside has produced those mixed results. But I think from a case perspective, this is where Taiwan, I think, is really interesting, because you can see repeatedly that Chiang Kai-shek is really dissatisfied with all of the conventional like band-aids that the United States is trying to offer Taiwan. And we even have some documentation from the Chinese side that the thing that really tips the lever is when there is the United States threatening to deploy nuclear weapons to the territory as a way of deterring Chinese aggression. And we sort of go through day by day by day of the case to show how that is shifting on like a hourly level between when the United States is saying, like, we're not going to deploy nuclear weapons, we're not even going to talk about doing that. Chiang Kai-shek says that's not enough. Then the United States, well, let's think about it. The Chinese get wind of that idea. Then the United States really contemplates it. Then they get scared off by Chiang Kai-shek a little bit because he seems really gung-ho for getting it. And we can actually trace, almost like on a half-day basis, using some of the documents from the archives, very specific changes in both the Taiwanese behavior and the Chinese response to that after the invocation of a discussion of nuclear weapons. So you're right. I think in the large N study, we're only looking at nuclear patrons and we're only looking at non-nuclear client states. And so we are making an inference that this universe is somehow different than conventional. But I think in the case studies, we get a little bit closer to seeing that causal mechanism actually play out. And that gives us some degree of confidence that it's not just the strength of the US military. We control for a lot of those variables in our large N. But it's not just the strength of the US military. It's not just the power of these individual allies or like the role that they play in the international system. It's the actual discussion of deploying nuclear weapons to a particular territory and the response to that from the adversary seems to be doing the heavy lifting. I don't know if that's compelling. Is it compelling? Well, we'll see. We'll see if you buy the book. So.
All right. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question about the variations that might exist between non-nuclear allies. And to what degree can their behavior be explained by their respective ability or inability to pursue a given course of action, and limitations due to economic, political, or technical factors. Anecdotally, you would expect that Canada, Japan, or the Philippines, for example, would each be expected to behave very differently. In the case of the Philippines, for example, there has been concern among defense planners, under different administrations, that on the one hand, they would act too aggressively, that on the other hand, they might actually defect. So is a statement that lacks the ability to spend more on the military or develop nuclear capability more likely to behave erratically or recklessly?
That's a really interesting point. And actually, as you were bringing up the Philippines example, and you said, are they more likely to act recklessly or defect? I thought, well, isn't that another cool variation or another cool manifestation of reckless behavior? Because cozying up to the Chinese and threatening to defect from the U.S. alliance is a form of recklessness that I think we should think about how to capture that. You're right. There is wide variation in how these allies are operating. I don't know if there's necessarily an economic basis for it. I think it probably comes from, because I don't know if it's like financially costly to like go and stir up trouble with a neighbor, even just using rhetoric, right? Like that's some of the ways in which these disputes are starting as someone gives a speech that is antagonizing of an adversary. So that may not be financially, you don't need a whole host of like financial resources to do that. But I think you're right that there's going to be some selection effects in what allies are doing and how that's going to manifest in those outcomes. So I think we want to think more about that. I think in the large N, it's going to be a little bit difficult to do, in part because there's not a great deal of variation in the data. But I think it's something to think about, especially when we come to our cases and our examples. So thank you very much.
Well, one more. Yes. Sorry, I'm getting to you as soon as we get to twos, but let me finish the ones.
There's a benefit to sitting in the back, maybe. So my question is sort of based on your research, how do you think the behavior of U.S. allies might differ from the behavior of allies whose nuclear patron is not the U.S.? And I know that most of the cases you're looking at are cases where the U.S. is the nuclear patron, they're U.S. alliances. And there are certainly fewer cases where other major nuclear powers have offered defensive agreements to non-nuclear countries. But I'm curious to sort of in behavior about restraint or recklessness, does it matter if the patron is not the US?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so phenomenal question. Thank you. Bless you. I will need to think about that. My hunch is yes, of course, it's going to change because the patron's risk portfolio is going to differ based on who they are. A Chinese patron is going to operate differently from a US patron, is going to operate differently than from a Russia patron. And also their preferences towards revisionism and changing the status quo are going to be different. So if you have an ally who's engaging in risky behavior from the US's perspective, but is just seeking to change the status quo that is in accord with the patron's behavior, their own patron's behavior, but maybe it's not seen as risky or reckless in the same way. So I think that's one thing that could change. I think another thing that could change is what the patron's response is going to be. It may not be beneficial to those patrons to avoid conflict. They themselves are maybe considered revisionist states, and so they wouldn't necessarily mind engaging in some degree of conflict with whoever the adversary is in that equation. I don't know enough about the Russian alliance system during the Soviet Union or even sort of the current Chinese alliances aside from North Korea. And there I think is a really good example of this, right? So we think that the North Koreans are engaging in pretty reckless behavior with all these missile tests and like purposeful antagonism of the United States. They're an allied client state of China. China obviously views that differently. They seem to largely care. I wish Taylor were here so he could correct me. They seem to largely care if that antagonism and reckless behavior results in some regime instability that leads to an overflow and over the border. So barring that or like lower than that, maybe they care a little bit less. And so their response is like bad North Korea in a different way than we would say that to an ally. So I definitely think they operate differently. I think we would also see different outcomes. I can't predict exactly what those outcomes would be, but I suspect we'd see a little bit more two-sided use of force, potentially a little bit more likelihood in militarized disputes. Probably still rationality at some point will kick in, and the Chinese or Russian patron, whoever it is, will say, we still do not want full-scale conflict with an adversary because that is pretty damaging, especially to the Chinese. So that's where I think that would go, but super good question. And if we get a chance to do another version of this project where we can look at non-US patrons, that would be something definitely to consider. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to shift to second question. So if you have a first question, if you haven't asked one, you can go to the front of the line if you raise your hand.
All right, so let's go back to issues that are important, security issues. And so I've been thinking about the why. Why would the client do this? So one would be, if I look at structural realism, doesn't seem to be a security dilemma if you have a patron like the US. But because it's extended deterrence, is there uncertainty about the patron's willingness to deter? Okay, that would support the structural realism. But Barry's argument in terms of greed seems more of an offensive realism, or at least close to maybe a classical realism here. Or is it a third, is it domestic? Are there domestic reasons why these patron state, these clients are being revisionist for high-level security issues? Any insight to those different reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably all three operating to some degree. I think the one that I would sort of, I think about a little bit more, and this is just a reflection of my training and like the way I think about the world, it's probably the third one. I've been trying to do a little bit more research on sort of domestic level actors engaging in nuclear or foreign policy decision making as some new parts of my research agenda. And the thing that I sort of think about in this case is, there could be all sorts of like internal pressures pushing on a leader to go and do something that's a little bit reckless. So I think there's probably pressures from like the military industrial complex. There might even be pressures from opposition leaders. It might be a form of coup-proofing, right? If you're worried that there's an opposition that is trying to present you as someone who's weak or someone who's not willing to stand up to like the US, then you might say, okay, well, I'm going to stand up to the US by having the slightly aggressive or like reckless behavior to an adversary to stymie potential opposition or to prevent a coup or something like that. So I sort of think about it from that perspective, but which of the three do you think is the one that's playing?
So I think if it's not security issues, then it's going to be, if it doesn't matter, then you have the luxury to be able to be revisionist.
Yeah. Okay.
Barry.
So this question is not fully formed, but I wonder if NATO members taken in after the Cold War ended behave differently from NATO members taken in the Cold War. Because my suspicion, which I cannot prove, is that the United States thought a bit about who would and would not be in and tried to select out those who might have enduring disputes or enduring problems or enduring risks. And after the Cold War ended, my own view, which is obviously jaundiced, is that the United States didn't think very hard about the various open issues that the new members might have. I'm not sure these differences rise to the level of a natural experiment of some kind, but I do wonder if they speak to a possible selection effect. My own intuition is that, I have an intuition about the answer to my question, but you can guess what it is. But I wonder what your view is.
Yeah, I think I have aligned views on this with you. I think I'm trying to think of an analogy, and I can't come up with a good one. I was thinking marriage, but I haven't finalized exactly how that looks. But I think you're absolutely right. There was a designing of NATO that had in mind who was going to be in. Okay, the analogy for me is the NPT. There was a designing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that had a sense of who was going to be in it, and who was not. And I think for NATO as well, when you start adding in states that had these completely wildly different histories before or during the Cold War compared to when they sign, the U.S. might be thinking, "Oh, I regret this decision. I really wish we designed this differently, or I really wish this had gone a little bit differently." And I wonder if the same thing will happen now, especially if there's if there's ever an inclusion of Ukraine into NATO at some point. But the analogy I'm also thinking about is like the EU including Hungary, and Hungary proving to be a bit of an obstinate partner to that, and continually raising issues that make the EU a little bit weary and uncomfortable, or doing things domestically that are not in accord with EU values. And so you're absolutely right. And it's something I would love to do more in the NATO chapter to disentangle. But I think I'm aligned with you that that's a very different set of actors depending on when they're joining, especially if they're joining after the Cold War.
So we're coming down to about 5 minutes left. We'll get some more questions in. I'll take the prerogative of the chair on behalf of our internet inquiry. And I think, and I'm probably misquoting you, that you said that you really hadn't considered that the Patron might drag its allies into a nuclear war. But certainly the perception on the part of the European public in the mid-1980s, perhaps some governments in Europe, but I don't want to drag that too far, was that Reagan's intervention on behalf of allies to install intermediate range missiles, in fact, was going to drag them into a nuclear war. But that's an observation. And then we'll come back. We'll start here and go back again. Yeah.
Apologies, one of the difficulties of only asking one question at a time. So go back to the question of...
5 minutes and you slip in the night.
Going back to the question of sort of why there's not more of this. I expected your answer to be part 2 of your book, that it has to do with this institutional design of assurances. So the question is there variation in assurance level as it has, sort of does the variation in assurance level have an effect on the variables you use to test moral hazard?
I don't think we've run those tests yet, so we will. That would obviously be great. I mean, I think the answer to that is yes and no. So the outcomes we look at in the second half of the book are not per se moral hazard. Well, I mean, I guess there is some degree of moral hazard depending on how you think about it, right? So domestic military spending, if that's disproportionately higher, if you get that fewer reliability enhancing provisions, then maybe that's going to draw you into more reckless behavior because you're like, oh, I have my own military now, I can do whatever I want. We haven't explicitly tested it, I guess I should say. But yes, you're right. Like it's something we cover in that section, but we should go back and look at what the likelihood of behavior is after that. Thank you.
This is sort of, I just hearing all this discussion, I'm still pulled back to, I think you made this comment about like two different categories of states, that there's like a very dangerous category of states that is likely to engage in this moral hazard type of behavior. It might be more powerful states or states with bigger ambitions, sort of like France with the Suez crisis, or it might be highly insecure states. So I don't know, Germany during the Cold War, or Taiwan, or South Korea. But I think there is a whole other category of states where the logic I described before can apply, especially within NATO. There's Iceland, there's Denmark, there's Belgium, a little bit closer to the lines. There's Luxembourg, everybody forgets about Luxembourg, Portugal. And you can also think about going to like today NATO versus Cold War NATO. Like Germany was reluctant to continue its nuclear sharing role up until the invasion of Ukraine. There was a lot of questions around that. So you have the old nuclear weapons, the old front line becoming somewhat more, I would say, like Canada, and more not really trying to seek reassurance in the way that they did during the Cold War. So I think it would be I think that this is a very important category of state, but I think it might be a category of states who'd be interested to try to see if you could come with some sort of model or theory as to what kind of states these are and how you differentiate states that might be driven by the logic of moral hazard as opposed to the logic of kind of like retrenchment, sitting back, doing other things as well. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to a close. I want to thank you all, even those who slandered me in my question style. I'll point out we got through all the questions of all the first-time questioners without having to go to a list at the end. So, but I assume we'll go back to the old system. Well, the only thing left is to thank our speaker for a wonderfully entertaining talk. And some of you are joining us for lunch afterwards, so